The gymnasium buzzed with excitement, filled with proud parents and beaming graduates. Balloons floated near the ceiling, and the faint scent of flowers lingered in the air. Julia Hartwell clutched her purse tightly, her eyes fixed on her daughter, Lila, who stood in a crisp cap and gown, trembling slightly as she waited for her name to be called. Julia's chest swelled with pride. All the long nights helping with homework, the countless early mornings, and every sacrifice had led to this moment. Her hand brushed against Lila's as they shared a nervous smile, and for a moment, Julia let herself believe that everything was perfect. The announcer called Lila's name, and applause erupted. Julia cheered along with the rest of the crowd, her voice cracking slightly with emotion. Lila walked across the stage, accepting her diploma with a shy, proud smile. Julia's heart felt full, almost too full for words. Then Derek's voice cut through the cheers, loud and sharp. "I can't do this anymore, Julia. I'm leaving you." The words hit like a hammer. Heads turned. Parents froze mid-applause, and a few whispered hurriedly to each other. Julia's hands fell to her lap. She felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath her. The color drained from her face. Derek didn't even bother to lower his voice. He stood there, tall and confident, smirking as though he had just delivered the punchline of a cruel joke. He looked at her, and in that moment, Julia saw the coldness in his eyes, the finality of his decision. Her mind spun, searching for words that wouldn't come. She wanted to scream, to grab him by the collar and shake some sense into him, but she forced herself to stay still. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, every heartbeat echoing the betrayal. Lila's eyes widened in shock, and Julia's heart ached seeing the hurt flicker across her daughter's face. Lila's hand reached for hers instinctively, but Julia's own hands shook as she squeezed back gently, trying to offer some semblance of reassurance. She could feel Lila's confusion, her struggle to understand something that didn't make sense. A father leaving on the very day meant to celebrate her accomplishments. The crowd murmured, whispers growing into a low hum. Julia's stomach twisted with anger and disbelief. She had spent years building a life with Derek, and for what? A momentary whim, a selfish choice that shattered their family in a public spectacle? She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Derek's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, apparently proud of the chaos he had caused. Julia felt a surge of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months: rage. Not the frantic, uncontrolled anger of a storm, but a quiet, focused fury that burned from the inside out. She could see clearly now that nothing she said would make him stay. But the humiliation, the betrayal, the audacity of doing this in front of their daughter, she wouldn't let it pass unanswered. As she took a deep breath, steadying herself, she realized she had a choice: to crumble here in the middle of the gymnasium, or to hold her head high and let this moment mark the beginning of something new. Her lips pressed into a thin line, eyes fixed on Derek, and the first spark of determination ignited. The auditorium was silent now, all eyes on the fractured family, and Julia felt, with bitter clarity, that her life as she knew it had just changed forever. Julia sat alone in the quiet of their living room, the sound of Lila's soft sobs drifting from her bedroom. The echoes of Derek's words at the graduation still rang in her ears. She thought about the past year, trying to make sense of it. Derek had changed slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. He had grown distant, spending more time at work or with vague excuses for meetings. He barely smiled at home anymore, and when he did, it felt forced. Conversations that used to flow easily were now filled with criticism or silence, leaving Julia walking on eggshells. She remembered nights when she would catch him staring at his phone, quickly turning it away whenever she looked. He had started to dismiss her ideas, her suggestions, her feelings, as if they didn't matter. At first, she tried to believe it was stress, that maybe he was just tired. But deep down, a gnawing unease had begun to grow. Now, in the harsh clarity after his announcement, she understood the truth. Julia had confronted him quietly a week ago, noticing the subtle signs, the lingering texts, the sudden secretive calls. He had denied everything, but something had always felt off. Tonight, alone, she searched through small clues she had tucked away. A hotel receipt he had forgotten to delete, a name that appeared too often in his messages: Vanessa. She felt her stomach twist. Vanessa was a co-worker, someone from his office who had crossed the line into betrayal. The realization burned through her. Derek hadn't just grown distant emotionally. He had been building a life outside their marriage while pretending nothing was wrong. Lila's face flashed in her mind, her daughter's innocent confusion, the way her small hands had reached for Julia's in the gymnasium. The hurt in her eyes cut deeper than Derek's betrayal itself. Lila had no reason to understand adult complexities, only that the family she knew had fractured in an instant. Julia's heart ached seeing her daughter caught in the middle of a selfish man's choices. She clenched her fists, feeling a mixture of sorrow and anger rise within her. It wasn't just the leaving, it was the deception, the lies, the pretense of normalcy while secretly tearing their lives apart. She had invested years into this marriage, into their family, and Derek had treated it all as disposable. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was calculated, cruel, and public. As she sat in the silence, Julia felt a shift within herself. The helplessness that had gripped her earlier began to transform into a simmering determination. She didn't want to break down or beg for reconciliation. She wanted justice, a quiet but undeniable reclaiming of control over the life Derek had tried to take from her. She would not let him humiliate her or hurt Lila without consequence. Julia's mind started forming plans, small at first, careful observations and subtle strategies. She would not act recklessly, but she would act with purpose. Every move Derek had made to deceive and dominate would be met with calculated resistance. A fire had ignited within her, a desire for truth, for balance, for a measured revenge that would restore dignity to herself and protect her daughter from further pain. The betrayal was deep, but so was her resolve. Julia checked into a small hotel on the edge of town, carrying only a suitcase and the weight of her thoughts. The room was quiet, almost painfully so, and she welcomed the stillness. For the first time since the graduation, she could breathe without the chaos of the gymnasium and Derek's voice echoing in her mind. She sank onto the bed, letting herself feel the shock, the disbelief, and the deep ache of betrayal. Her hands trembled as memories of the last year played like a film she hadn't wanted to watch. She remembered the nights she had stayed up, working late into the evening to manage both her career and the home, while Derek's demands grew heavier. She had left her own job to move closer to his office, sacrificing her independence to support his ambitions. She had attended every meeting, every dinner, and every event with a smile, even when she felt invisible. Derek had rarely acknowledged her efforts, dismissing her hard work as expected or ordinary. Over time, his coldness had worn her down, but she had stayed, believing in their family, in their promises. Tears blurred her vision as she recalled the moments she had quietly endured. His sharp words, the nights she had spent comforting him while he vented about stress, the times she had masked her own hurt to keep the household calm. All of it now felt like a cruel setup, a preparation for the day he chose to leave. The magnitude of the betrayal pressed down on her, but beneath the pain, a spark of anger began to burn. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. Clara's name flashed on the screen. Julia answered, trying to steady her voice. "I heard what happened, Julia. You didn't deserve this," Clara said gently. Ethan joined in the conversation shortly after, both of them offering words of comfort and concern. They listened as Julia recounted the events, their support steady but firm. Clara's voice carried an edge of truth she couldn't ignore. "You've put up with so much for too long, Julia. You deserve more than quiet suffering." Julia let the words sink in. She had spent so much time accommodating Derek's whims, managing his moods, and protecting their family's image that she had neglected herself. Now, in the solitude of the hotel room, clarity began to form. The anger that had been simmering in the shadows transformed into determination. She could not undo the past, but she could shape what came next. She began to think strategically, her mind mapping small, deliberate moves. She would regain control over her life, over her finances, and over the narrative Derek had tried to dictate. Her revenge would not be reckless or vengeful in the obvious sense. It would be precise, subtle, and undeniable. She considered every detail, every moment of oversight from Derek, and how she could turn them to her advantage. By the time Julia turned off the lights, exhaustion mixed with purpose filled her. The heartbreak was still there, raw and real, but it was now accompanied by a calculated resolve. She would rise from this betrayal stronger, smarter, and ready to reclaim everything Derek had taken for granted. The first steps of her plan were forming in her mind, careful and deliberate, each one a quiet promise of justice. Julia returned to her family's old house, a place filled with memories of comfort and warmth. The familiar creak of the floorboards and the smell of her mother's garden brought a sense of peace she hadn't felt in months. She unpacked her belongings slowly, taking her time to settle in. The house was hers for the first time in years, and the feeling of control over her own space energized her. She began to arrange things exactly as she wanted, from the furniture to the smallest decorations, and with each adjustment, she felt pieces of herself returning. She enrolled in night classes at the local community college, choosing courses she had always wanted to take but had put off for Derek's convenience. Accounting, literature, and creative writing filled her evenings, and the excitement of learning again gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't realized she missed. Balancing studies and her responsibilities at home was challenging, but it reminded her that she was capable of more than she had allowed herself to believe. Julia also focused on herself physically. Early mornings were spent jogging through the quiet streets, feeling her body strengthen and her mind clear. She joined a small fitness class, meeting people who encouraged her and cheered for her progress. As she improved, her confidence grew. She no longer felt like the woman overshadowed by Derek's presence and arrogance. Instead, she felt vibrant, independent, and unstoppable. Meanwhile, Derek began noticing the changes. At first, he ignored them, confident she would still crumble under the weight of his absence. But small whispers reached him. Friends and colleagues casually commenting on Julia's energy, her new skills, her poise. He saw her thriving, smiling genuinely, and interacting with others in ways that reminded him of the woman he had once taken for granted. Frustration bubbled beneath his surface. He tried to assert control, calling and texting, attempting to guilt her, but Julia remained calm, her focus unshaken. She began weaving subtle hints about his infidelity into casual conversations with mutual friends and acquaintances. A passing remark about honesty in relationships, a carefully placed anecdote about trust, never direct, but enough to make people curious, suspicious. Derek could sense it. Whispers and sideways glances followed him, though he had no idea who was planting the seeds. Julia watched quietly, a small smile tugging at her lips, knowing the tension was growing. Each day, Julia's life became fuller and richer. Lila thrived in school, buoyed by her mother's calm strength. Julia's social circle expanded, new friendships forming naturally from shared classes and interests. She carried herself with a dignity and self-assurance that Derek could not match, and it irritated him more than any confrontation ever could. The balance of power had shifted. Julia was no longer the woman waiting for him to choose her or notice her worth. Every subtle action, every hint dropped in passing, built the tension quietly, like a storm forming on the horizon. Derek's frustration was growing, but he could not yet see the full plan taking shape. Julia's quiet, deliberate moves were setting the stage for the eventual payoff, and with each day, her control over the situation strengthened. Derek strutted into social gatherings with Vanessa on his arm, a smug smile plastered across his face. He seemed to enjoy the attention, showing off as if he had won some victory over Julia. Every time he walked into a room, he made sure people noticed her absence and his apparent triumph. He told stories about their weekend trips and lavish dinners, clearly expecting admiration and assuming Julia was crushed and invisible somewhere in the background. Julia watched from the sidelines, calm and collected. She greeted friends with warm smiles, laughed at genuine jokes, and carried herself with an ease Derek could not touch. He looked around for the signs of her despair he had expected, but there were none. She didn't flinch, didn't scowl, and didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Derek's confidence began to waver ever so slightly, though he tried hard to hide it. To everyone else, Julia appeared composed, strong, and unaffected, while Derek's arrogance started to feel hollow. Lila noticed the difference immediately. She had been heartbroken when her father announced he was leaving, but now she saw her mother standing taller, smiling brighter, and moving forward despite the betrayal. Julia no longer seemed fragile or lost. Instead, she seemed determined and in control. Lila began to mirror that quiet strength, learning that resilience didn't have to be loud or aggressive. It could be steady, unwavering, and undeniable. Every day, she watched her mother regain pieces of herself that Derek had tried to diminish, and it filled her with hope and pride. Julia started letting subtle gestures do the work her words didn't need to. At parties and family gatherings, she would mention achievements or plans casually. Her new classes, volunteer work, small accomplishments, always with a soft smile, never boasting. Friends and acquaintances began to notice her growth and energy, and Derek's attempts to overshadow her only highlighted his insecurity. The more he flaunted Vanessa, the smaller and more foolish he began to appear by contrast. Derek's ego, once untouchable, became Julia's tool. She would drop quiet hints in conversations, subtly pointing out Derek's recklessness, his poor decisions, and the obvious superficiality of his new relationship. She never accused or confronted him directly. Instead, she allowed mutual friends and colleagues to start piecing together the truth themselves. Every sarcastic smile, every calm acknowledgement of her own progress, chipped away at his inflated sense of superiority. Julia's psychological revenge was precise. It wasn't about humiliation in the traditional sense. It was about hitting Derek in the one place he valued most, his ego. Watching him squirm silently while she remained unshaken brought a quiet satisfaction she had never felt before. Derek could not understand her strength. He could not predict her moves. Every interaction became a subtle reminder that he had miscalculated, that Julia was not broken, and that his arrogance was his own undoing. In every glance and every gesture, Julia made it clear. She was thriving without him, and he had no power over her anymore. Lila, absorbing her mother's calm strength, began to see the possibility of her own resilience. Derek's world of arrogance and showmanship was crumbling quietly, without Julia ever needing to raise her voice. Julia sat at the kitchen table, papers spread in front of her, a quiet thrill running through her. She had been reviewing old bank statements, mortgage documents, and business accounts, just to keep herself busy and informed. That's when she noticed it, a small financial loophole, buried in the legal paperwork, that gave her more control over their shared assets than Derek had ever realized. Her pulse quickened. This was an opportunity she could use carefully and strategically. She spent the next few days studying the accounts, planning her moves with precision. She didn't act rashly. Every step had to be calculated. She discovered she could redirect payments, delay transfers, and limit access to funds Derek needed without drawing attention immediately. It was subtle, invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention, but it was effective. She felt a surge of empowerment just knowing the leverage she held. When Derek tried to book a series of extravagant trips for Vanessa, he found himself hitting obstacle after obstacle. Payments were delayed, reservations kept falling through, and funds seemed mysteriously unavailable. At first, he assumed it was a banking error or a mistake in planning. But as the problems continued, frustration began to bubble over. Vanessa noticed. She grew impatient, questioning Derek's competence. For the first time, the man who had seemed so in control in public began to falter in private. Julia didn't gloat, at least not outwardly. She continued her daily life, attending classes, spending time with Lila, volunteering, and enjoying the small victories of independence. But inside, she savored the tension building quietly around Derek. Every frustrated call, every awkward explanation to Vanessa, was a reminder of the power he had underestimated her ability to wield. She was no longer invisible, no longer powerless. The change was subtle but undeniable. Derek's arrogance, which had been his shield and weapon, started to crack. He had always believed he could manipulate every situation and every person. But now he was forced to navigate complications he hadn't anticipated. Vanessa's disappointment in him grew with each misstep, and Derek, who had thrived on control and admiration, began to appear less confident, less capable, and increasingly vulnerable. Julia felt her sense of empowerment deepen with each passing day. She realized that revenge didn't have to be loud or public to be effective. Quiet, strategic actions could dismantle arrogance, expose weaknesses, and create consequences that the guilty never saw coming. The satisfaction came not from direct confrontation, but from watching the results unfold naturally, like a plan carefully executed behind the scenes. Lila continued to observe her mother with admiration. She saw that strength wasn't always about anger or aggression. Sometimes it was about intelligence, patience, and subtlety. Julia's calm, deliberate actions were teaching her daughter a powerful lesson about resilience and reclaiming power after betrayal. By the end of the week, Julia knew the turning point had arrived. She had shifted the balance completely. Derek's control over his life and over her was slipping, and the public redemption she was quietly preparing for was only a matter of time. She smiled to herself, confident in the knowledge that the storm Derek had started would eventually leave him exposed, while she emerged stronger than ever. Julia arrived at the grand ballroom early, her dress simple but elegant, her hair perfectly styled, and her presence calm yet commanding. The charity gala was buzzing with chatter, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of a string quartet. Derek and Vanessa were expected to make a public announcement of their engagement, a spectacle meant to show off their happiness and Derek's supposed triumph. Julia walked in with steady confidence, knowing exactly what she intended to do. As she mingled, she remembered the years she had spent supporting Derek. She recalled the nights she had stayed awake while he focused on work or personal pursuits, the holidays she had planned around his schedule, and the sacrifices she had made to build the life he now flaunted. Every memory stung, but it also fueled her resolve. The emotional satisfaction of showing the world Derek's true character made every small effort worthwhile. She positioned herself strategically, speaking to influential people in the room and casually steering conversations toward honesty, integrity, and respect in relationships. Each comment was subtle, never directly mentioning Derek, but just enough to plant seeds of doubt. A gentle remark about the importance of transparency, a story about someone who valued loyalty over appearances. These small hints were carefully crafted to make Derek's arrogance uncomfortable without her having to lift a finger against him. Meanwhile, Derek entered with Vanessa, both radiant and confident, completely unaware of the subtle trap being laid. He smiled, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, and moving through the room with practiced charm. To the casual observer, it seemed like the perfect moment, but Julia's presence and quiet maneuvering were setting the stage for something he couldn't control. Every misplaced glance, every whispered question he overheard, slowly unsettled him. Julia caught Lila's eyes across the room. Her daughter stood quietly, observing her mother with awe. Lila had witnessed the slow transformation, the reclaiming of independence, the subtle power plays, and the rebuilding of confidence. Seeing her mother in control, poised, and calm in the face of Derek's arrogance gave her a sense of security and pride she had never felt before. The lessons of strength and quiet intelligence were becoming real in front of her eyes. As the announcement drew near, Julia remained composed, smiling politely at acquaintances while keeping an unshakable calm that contrasted sharply with Derek's growing unease. He began noticing the whispers, the sideways glances, and the small murmurs of speculation that seemed to follow his every move. Each one was a reflection of the careful groundwork Julia had laid in the days and weeks prior. In her mind, Julia replayed the years of emotional labor she had invested in their marriage. The sacrifices, the unspoken endurance, and the patience she had exercised even when Derek failed to notice. The memory gave her a quiet thrill, knowing that the culmination of all her subtle planning would reveal the truth to everyone in that room. By the time the gala reached its peak, the tension in the air was palpable. Derek remained blissfully unaware that his carefully constructed image of success and charm was beginning to crumble. Julia, poised and confident, knew the moment of public confrontation would arrive soon, and when it did, the payoff of years of betrayal and emotional endurance would be undeniable. The gala was at its peak, with chandeliers casting warm light over the elegantly dressed guests. Julia moved gracefully through the crowd, her calm demeanor drawing quiet attention. She smiled politely at familiar faces, listening and nodding, planting seeds carefully with each conversation. She spoke about trust, integrity, and honesty in relationships, framing her words as general observations. Every comment landed like a soft but persistent echo, hinting at Derek's failures without ever directly accusing him. Derek, meanwhile, was in his element, or so he thought. He stood with Vanessa, ready to make their grand announcement, flashing smiles and shaking hands. The attention and admiration of the crowd fueled his ego, and he had no idea that the foundation he had built on arrogance was already cracking. Guests started glancing at each other, picking up on Julia's subtle cues. Questions began to bubble in hushed tones. Had Derek really been as trustworthy and capable as he appeared? Julia's plan unfolded quietly, like a thread unraveling a tightly knit fabric. She spoke to mutual friends and influential attendees, sharing small, verifiable details. Stories of financial mismanagement, the manipulations Derek had used to control situations, and subtle revelations about his betrayal. She never shouted, never pointed fingers. She let the facts speak for themselves. Each story was carefully told with a calm and composed tone, leaving no doubt about the truth. Derek noticed the shift almost too late. Whispers spread, eyes widened, and the energy in the room changed. He tried to interject, to defend himself, but his words sounded defensive and hollow. The more he argued, the more obvious it became that he had been caught. Guests murmured, comparing notes, and the web of deception he had relied on for years began to unravel in real time. His voice rose in frustration, even anger, but it only amplified the perception of guilt. Vanessa, standing beside him, looked confused and increasingly uncomfortable. She had believed Derek was flawless, that he was the man everyone admired. But as she watched his tantrum, the excuses, and the growing unease of the crowd, her admiration turned to doubt. Murmurs of disappointment and shock reached her ears, and realization hit. She had aligned herself with someone who was not only arrogant but untrustworthy. Slowly, she stepped back, her confidence shaken, leaving Derek to face the consequences alone. Julia remained composed throughout. She did not gloat, did not raise her voice, and did not celebrate. Her calmness, her poise, and her dignity contrasted sharply with Derek's unraveling, making the truth even more evident. Guests saw a woman who had endured betrayal, who had quietly reclaimed her strength, and who now stood unshakable while the man who had humiliated her fell apart. By the end of the evening, Derek's reputation was in tatters. His carefully constructed image of control and superiority had crumbled in front of everyone he knew. Julia, serene and dignified, moved through the crowd with her head held high, her revenge complete. Not with anger, but with the undeniable power of truth and composure. After the gala, Julia and Lila returned home, the quiet of the evening a welcome contrast to the chaos they had witnessed. Lila, usually reserved, took her mother's hand and looked into her eyes. "Mom, I'm so proud of you," she said softly. "I've never seen anyone stand so strong and so calm. You showed me what real strength looks like." Julia felt a warmth spread through her chest. Her daughter's words were more powerful than any applause or recognition. It was validation she had longed for, not from strangers, but from the person who mattered most in her life. Over the next few weeks, the aftermath of the gala played out in the open. Derek found himself facing consequences he had never imagined. Colleagues who had admired him quietly distanced themselves. Mutual friends who had once supported him began to question his character. Business associates withdrew invitations and opportunities. Without Vanessa by his side and with his credibility in tatters, Derek was left professionally and socially isolated. Each rejection and whisper of doubt reminded him of the control he had lost, and he realized too late that his arrogance had led to his downfall. Meanwhile, Julia embraced the freedom she had fought so hard to reclaim. She returned to her own life with renewed energy, focusing on things that brought her fulfillment. She continued her night classes, explored new hobbies, and reconnected with old friends. Every small achievement reinforced her confidence, and the independence she had built gave her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving, fully in charge of her own life. Her relationship with Lila deepened in ways that mattered most. They spent evenings cooking together, laughing over shared stories, and planning weekends filled with simple joys. Julia taught Lila not only about resilience but also about dignity and self-respect. Lila, in turn, inspired Julia with her optimism and curiosity, reminding her why fighting through betrayal was worth every struggle. The bond they shared became unshakable, a source of mutual strength and comfort. Julia also took time to reflect on herself. She recognized the ways she had been silenced and diminished in her marriage, and she promised herself never to allow that again. She set boundaries, pursued goals that mattered to her, and made choices guided by her own values and desires rather than anyone else's expectations. The empowerment she felt wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming her identity and living life on her own terms. Days turned into weeks, and the story of Derek's public humiliation faded in gossip and memory, but Julia's transformation endured. She had turned pain into purpose, betrayal into clarity, and humiliation into strength. Life wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and she could finally breathe without fear or restraint. Sitting on the porch one evening, Lila beside her, Julia watched the sunset and felt a profound sense of closure. She had survived betrayal, she had reclaimed her life, and she had done it with grace. The past no longer held power over her. She smiled at Lila and said, "We're going to be okay. More than okay, we're going to be strong." And for the first time in years, Julia truly believed it. Julia sat quietly on the porch, a warm cup of tea in her hands, watching the early light of dawn spill across the neighborhood. The house was peaceful, filled with the soft hum of morning birds and the distant sounds of neighbors beginning their day. She let herself breathe deeply, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. The months of heartbreak, betrayal, and carefully planned revenge felt like a distant storm now, replaced by a calm clarity she had never known. She thought back to the moment at the graduation, the shocking announcement, and the whirlwind that followed. The pain had been raw, nearly unbearable, but it had forced her to see her own strength. Every sleepless night, every tear shed, and every strategic move she made had led her here. to a place where she controlled her life and her happiness. Julia understood now that the most satisfying revenge was not exposing Derek or humiliating him for the sake of pride. It was reclaiming herself. It was living fully, boldly, and with dignity intact. Lila appeared beside her, wrapping an arm around Julia's waist. "Mom, look at the sunrise," she whispered, pointing toward the horizon where soft pink and gold colors stretched endlessly. Julia smiled, feeling the warmth of her daughter's presence. In that simple moment, she realized how far they had come together. Lila had witnessed her mother's resilience, learned lessons of strength, patience, and self-respect. And Julia had found joy in guiding her, in modeling what it meant to stand firm even when life felt unfair. The memory of Derek's arrogance and betrayal no longer carried the same sting. His isolation, the loss of respect he once commanded, and the failure of his new relationship were consequences that had naturally unfolded without Julia needing to act out of spite. She had learned that true power lay in self-possession, not in hurting others. By remaining calm and dignified, she had turned the tables without sacrificing her own peace. The sun rose higher, filling the porch with gentle light. Julia felt a sense of renewal wash over her. The horizon symbolized a new beginning, a chapter she could write freely, unshackled from the past. Each breath felt like an affirmation of her independence. Each glance at Lila a reminder of why she had fought so hard for this life. They were no longer victims of circumstance or betrayal. They were survivors, resilient and strong. Julia took Lila's hand and held it tightly. "We're ready for what comes next," she said softly. Lila squeezed her hand back, smiling. Together, they watched the sun climb, each ray reflecting hope, healing, and the promise of a future built on courage and self-respect. Julia's heart felt light, her mind clear, and her spirit unbroken. The journey had been painful, but it had forged a version of herself she could be proud of. Julia knew that no matter what challenges might arise, she and Lila would face them together, strong and undaunted. As the day began, she allowed herself to smile fully, letting the warmth of the sunrise mark the start of a life reclaimed, a dignity restored, and a story of true resilience finally complete.